Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing something new, something fun, a top 10 list. Top 10 list of the worst signposted uncommons for limited play, of course. This is just a fun little list that I threw together. I figured make a little video like this during the holiday kind of magic downtime that we often have. And please, if you do like this video, let me know. I have a bunch of other lists that I could be making. As I was piecing this together, I was like, oh, that's a good card for that kind of list. So if you like this kind of video, maybe we can make it a staple going forward. All right, let's dive in. So our top 10 list today is top 10 worst signpost uncommons. And if you're not familiar with the term signpost uncommon, it's basically just the cycle of gold uncommons you see in basically every draft set these days. Just like an old-timey signpost here, they literally point you in the direction you're supposed to go. So if you open a good blue rare and then you get past Captain Storm in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, you go, okay, even if you don't know that much about the set, say this is your first draft of the format and you haven't looked at the cards, you can go, all right, Captain Storm clearly wants me to draft artifacts and it wants me to draft pirates, so you can have some sort of theme to build towards. And of course, if you've been playing a while, you'll know that these signposts, sometimes they work out and they're really great cards. They're cards that pull you into their decks, and sometimes they're not good at all. Like sometimes they're just cards that are bad on rate, or the themes that they represent don't work out. A lot of the cards on this list are going to be one of those two things, actually, either just like not a good card or the theme of the card didn't work out. And in the worst cases, it's both. Just a bad card and its theme didn't work out. Just to lay out some parameters just quickly, we're going to be looking at cards from OG Theros, so 2013 going forward, because Theros was the first block, the first set that really had this idea of gold signposts and commons. There was kind of hints of it here and there before, but really this concept from the designer side came into its own around Theros. So we're only going to be going Theros going forward. That still gives us a decade worth of sets to work with, so it's a lot of cards we can choose from. And also, I'm not going to be looking at gold sets specifically. So Ravnica sets, Strixhaven, the reason being that in these sets, each color pair generally gets like 4 or 5 golden commons, and not all of them are actually directly supposed to be for limited play. I think there are some like oddballs in there, some cards that maybe are meant for constructed or commander or something, so not necessarily like pointed at us as limited players. So I decided to leave them off the list, because honestly, if I included these, I think the entire list would just be these cards. Stuff like Goblin Test Pilot, Join Shields, Lower Hell Excavation, which are very funny cards to look at, but I felt it, would skew the list a little bit too much. And just one final thought before I jump in, the way that I chose to order the cards, like why I decided to put some cards at 1, 2, 3, 4, is mostly based on vibes. It's mostly based on my interpretation, but I also do have the 17 lands win rate where that's available. Some of these cards are so old that they weren't on Arena, so we won't have data for that. So yeah, you'll see some win rate numbers as we go through these, but ultimately, the cards where they ended up in the list were where I felt they should go. All right, and without further ado, number 10 on our list here is Mournwillow, originally printed in Shadows over Innistrad block, specifically Eldritch Moon, and then reprinted in Shadows over Innistrad Remastered. And this card is at number 10 and not higher on this list because it's not a horrendous magic card, right? It's a 3-mana 3/2 haste. It's got this Delirium ability that makes your creatures a little bit harder to block. The problem with this card, though, and the reason why its win rate was not very good, is it's so at odds with what the Delirium mechanic asks you to do in general, or the kind of strategy you want to play. Generally, the Delirium deck, for those who haven't played this block, it's all about just filling your grave, kind of a slow, grindy plan. You've got a card like Moldgraph Scavenger here, which is a 2-mana 0/4 that then turns into a 3/4 in the late game to start to turn the corner. Like, when I think about drafting a Delirium deck, I'm just thinking about grinding at the game, then maybe winning with a good rare or a good expensive card. Winning by, like, playing a Mournwillow and then making all your creatures kind of harder to block isn't how I expect my grindy deck to win. So, like, this is a card that I would love to pick the designer's brain. Whoever came up with this card, or the group of people that came up with this card, I would love to know, like, their thoughts on why this was the payoff for this Delirium deck. Now, I will say, I actually have played Mournwillow to good effect, but it was more in, like, a green aggro deck that happened to have black as, like, a slight splash. Like I said, it's an effective card at what it does, but what it does is just, like, so at odds with the Delirium strategy in general. So I think Mournwillow deserves the number 10 slot in this spot. Again, not because it's a terrible magic card, just because it's got a lot of dissonance with generally what you wanted to do in this deck. Coming in at number 9, we've got Invade the City from War of the Spark. And this is funny. This is a card that actually, we do have data for this set on 17 lands. We have War of the Spark on 17 lands. But this card just wasn't played enough for there to be enough data to give me a win rate. And the reason it wasn't played enough is it's just not a very good card, just like a lot of the cards in this list. The problem with it is it just takes a lot of effort for not a lot of payoff, right? The juice just isn't really worth the squeeze. What you end up doing is, like, say you do have a heavy spell deck, and you need a very heavy spell deck to be able to play this card and not just be like 3 mana for 2/2 worth of stats, right? You really want 10, 11, 12 spells. So you're like filling your grave in the early game, maybe on turn 5 or 6 you cast this, and your payoff is like maybe 5/5 worth of stats for 3 mana. And remember, with the amass mechanic, it's not like you're getting a 5/5 token. Sometimes you're just getting a +5/+5 aura, which is much worse than just getting like a 5/5 on its own. So the concept for this card, fill your grave, and then eventually you get a big thing based on how many spells you have in your grave, I actually think is a fine concept, but tacking it onto a mass, I think gives it some awkward tension there. I also think that this could easily like cost 2 and it would be fine probably. And in fact, a few years later in M21, they actually updated this card, kind of gave it a bit of a different spin in Experimental Overload, which I think is just like a much better way to do this card. It is 4 mana, so it's more mana than Invade the City, but you do just get an XX token, right, instead of amassing, and you get a spell back from your graveyard. This card was great. This is actually one of the better uncommons from this set. Really sweet card. So I think this was just kind of like a proof of concept gone wrong in a lot of ways, and they kind of did right on the card a few years later. So not a card, if you're ever drafting War of the Spark, not a card you should be drawn towards. Invade the City, number 9 on this list. And coming in at number 8 on this list is Asari Captain from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. And this card is emblematic of this samurai attacking alone deck just being a big flop. The idea behind the samurai deck is sort of, you get to the point when you're playing an aggro deck where there comes a turn where your opponent's stabilized and you can't really attack. So after the board's kind of stalled out and your creatures can't get in, you say, all right, well, I'm just going to send them in one at a time, and they'll get a boost from my Asari Captain, and maybe they'll get a boost from my other cards that care about attacking alone, something like Imperial Subduer or Aki Ronin. The issue is, though, that in the games that don't stall out, these cards are just underrated, because you want to be attacking with all your creatures generally. Like, the attacking alone thing is plan B, when you can't get an attack with all your creatures. And in the games where your opponent's not really putting up that much of a fight and you just want to curve out on them, these cards are understated, right? Asari Captain is a 5 mana 4/3 haste. Imperial Subduer, 3 mana 3/2. Aki Ronin, 2 mana 1/3, right? All these kind of like small understated creatures where if things are going well for you, they don't perform that well. They kind of only perform well if things aren't going that well for you. And again, that's kind of your plan B. So this mechanic, I actually think they could probably tweak it, maybe make these cards a bit better on rate. Like if Asari Captain was just a 5/4, or if, Imperial Subduer was maybe 2 mana. And in fact, actually, I remember when they alchemized this set, they actually did change a lot of these cards to give them updated text to make them a little bit better on their own. But in their paper printed forms, just not good enough. So Asari Captain, pretty bad on rate by itself. And again, it's really emblematic of this mechanic or this archetype not being very good. Number 8 on the list. All right, coming in at number 7 on our list is Elite Headhunter from Original Eldraine. And the issue with this card is an issue that you'll see on a few other cards that we're going to get to. It's that it's a 4 mana 2/3. It's just so understated for being a 4 mana card. I talk about this a lot, but I think people generally aren't picky enough with the stats for their 4 mana cards. You'll see this time and time again. They like to print these cards that are like 4 mana 3/3 that gives you a little bit of value potentially as the game goes on, but you're not going to get to that point where the game goes on if you're playing a 4 mana 3/3. That's the main issue with these kind of cards. And Elite Headhunter, of course, is a 4 mana 2/3, which is even tougher. The mana cost looks a bit scary, but if you didn't play Original Eldraine, it was a monocolored set, so you could cast this card pretty easily. And then its ability, 3 mana to sack something, deal 2 damage to a creature. That's a lot. Like, you're sacrificing a permanent, paying 3 mana just to deal 2 damage. At least with Ashiok's Reaper or cards like it, you kind of don't have to invest any more mana into it. I mean, sure, you have to cast spells to do something, but you're going to be casting spells anyways. With Elite Headhunter, to make up for the fact that you're, once again, I want to really highlight, you're casting a 4 mana 2/3, you then have to invest more mana and more cards to get a small effect, right? I just think Elite Headhunter is just so emblematic of this kind of card, and just a type of card I'd really advise you shy away from. Coming in at number 6, we've got Shesra Death's Whisper from Adventures in the Forgotten Realm, the D&D set. And this is exactly like the last card we just looked at, 4 mana, understated, even more understated, it's a 1/3. It's got a few abilities that, once again, try to make up for the fact that you're casting a 4 mana 1/3, but both the abilities aren't that good. The first ability here, whenever it enters the battlefield, target creature blocks this turn of able, you can definitely set up certain situations where that's pretty good. Just imagine you have a 3-3, they have a 2-2. Okay, they're going to be forced to block with that 2-2, but they can also block with other things. They can just double block, right? So if they have two 2-2s, they just block your 3-3. That's just like not a good trade anyways. And then you can pay 2 life because a creature's going to die to draw a card, but 2 life is a lot of life. So it's just a lot of situational hoops to jump through. And I mentioned when we talked about Asari Captain, the Samurai deck, that they alchemize some cards, and usually when they alchemize cards, they actually change it so it's not like a strict upgrade on the card. They'll be like, okay, we'll make a card cheaper, but we'll make its power and toughness a little bit more. They did that with Shestra. They alchemized it, but the change to Shestra is just pure upside. They made it a whole mana cheaper and gave it a point of toughness. And I actually think that's what this card needs to be a competitive card. And when I say competitive, I don't mean like in standard and constructed or whatever. I'm just saying like a playable Magic card in any reasonable format, you know? So if this was the printed text on Shestra, I actually think it would be an okay card. At least you're getting like a 3-mana 1/4. Not horrendous stats, but as the 4-mana 1/3, that's just too high of a cost. So Shestra, number 6 on our list here. All right, we're on to the top 5 here. Coming in number 5, we've got an older card here, Belligerent Brontodon, and this is from Original Ixalan. And if you didn't play Original Ixalan, it was one of the faster formats we've seen, just really blistering fast. So in a fast format, I'm already going to be dinging a card that costs more than 4 mana, right? And a 7 mana card is a lot in a fast format. So what do you get for your 7 mana? Well, you get a 4/6, but not exactly the full story because it has an ability here. Each creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. So you're getting a whopping 6/6 for 7 mana. And you might imagine, okay, well, maybe there's a lot of high toughness creatures to really, this comes down on 7, and you can just like attack with all your 1/4s, but really there weren't that many cards to support this deck either. Something like Ixali's Diviner was one of the better ones. It could be like a 2-mana 1/4, but other than that, you had like Grazing Whiptail, which turned from a 3/4 to a 4/4. So even if you did the thing, like you're like, oh, I built a high toughness deck, and even if you could get to 7 mana, which was not a given, definitely not a given, it just didn't do that much. So this was a card that went like last pick almost every single time. Like green-white, I remember drafting green-white maybe once, and it definitely wasn't for this kind of card. It was more just like good green and white cards I picked up. Ixalan's old enough that we don't have 17 lands data for it, but I would imagine that Belligerent Brontodon would perform in like the 47-48% game in hand win rate range. Like truly not a very good card. Coming in number 5 on the list here. All right, and coming in at number 4, we've got Hazardous Conditions, and this one was from Kaladesh. This is a card that has quite a few problems in my mind. Number 1, it's overcosted. Usually you expect your -2/-2 effects to be 3 mana, and in general, these -2/-2 effects aren't great main deck cards, right? Usually we put them in the sideboard, bring them in if our opponents have a lot of small creatures. You can main deck them once in a while, but I generally think it's not a great idea. And the reason it's overcosted, like the reason they tacked an additional mana onto it, is it's got this build around aspect where the dream is, all right, well, if all of my creatures have counters and none of yours have counters, then your creatures die and then mine don't. But there are some issues with that. Number 1, Kaladesh was a set that, for its time, I remember there was some analysis done, and for its time, it was the set with the biggest creatures, just power toughness ratio to the mana cost. It had big creatures for the time. Peema Outrider, 4 mana 4/4, trample, fabricate 1. That card was really above rate. Like, I remember seeing that card for the first time and going, holy crap, that we're getting this set common now? Of course, these days, this is kind of like a commonplace thing, but -2/-2 just did not kill that many things. You even had like 2 mana 2/3s in this set, which were above rate at the time too. The other problem is the fabricate mechanic, which, you might think like, okay, I'm building around this in black-green. Black-green was the +1/+1 counters deck, but other colors got +1/+1 counters too. Fabricate wasn't just in black-green. It was in white as well. There was even a colorless card or two that had Fabricate. So you just had multiple levels of things that could go wrong with your Hazardous Condition, on top of it being a little bit overcosted. Certainly still a fine sideboard card, but as a main deck card, comes in at number 4 on our list. Coming in at number 3, you've got the Invasion of Kylum, a battle. And this is actually a bit of a stand-in for the aggressive battles from March in the Machine. I think that this is the worst of the bunch, just not a very good effect, just pretty awkward to use. There's the dream scenario where you get to cast it and flip it right away, but that 4 mana for +2/+0 and vigilance to 2 creatures, that's just not a very good effect for that amount of mana. And I want to highlight, I think, an issue with these aggressive battles, and you saw it on some of the other aggressive leaning battles too, something like the Invasion of Moog as well, where I think they were really worried. They really were conservative. about the play pattern of going like, play my battle, flip it right away, and now I'm just way ahead. And I think it's a good thing to be concerned about. I do think they undershot on these aggressive battles just a little bit. You know, I think they could have tweaked them and made them playable cards. Maybe they could have given the Invasion of Kylam 4 defense instead of 5. And I think that the next time they do battles, I think they're going to tweak this, right? Just like I talked about the kind of proof of concept with Invade the City. I think that this was their first go at it, and next time they're going to tweak it just right. The best battles in March of the Machine ended up being kind of the slower ones, right? Think of Invasion of Amonkhet, just more the battles that you kind of were fine sitting on the battlefield for a while. They gave you some value when you came in, and then eventually you'd flip them. The ones that go in aggressive decks, I'm really excited to see what they do with them, because I do think they probably know that this was an issue. But the first outing, Invasion of Kylam being kind of the worst offender, comes in number 3 on the list here. All right, and coming in at number 2, we've got Legolas Counter of Kills. And this is actually the card that inspired me to make this list. When I saw this card for the first time, you know, there was all these Lord of the Rings cards coming out for Commander and just a bunch of different products. I was thinking this was just some card that was in like a starter deck or something like that. Like I did not imagine this was our gold signpost uncommon for this archetype, because once again, it's just like 4 mana, 2/3, and it's got a bunch of fancy abilities, but the abilities just aren't that great. They don't play that well together. And of course, for anybody that played Lord of the Rings, you know that blue-green tapping stuff just wasn't a good archetype in general. So you've got a bad card, an understated card, plus the archetype wasn't very good. Smack those together, and you've got a card that you were just embarrassed to lose to this card. If you ever lost this card, you felt pretty bad about it. I guess you felt pretty good about it if you did win with it, but not a card that I ever saw get bigger than like a 4/5, and even then, it wasn't much of a problem. So, Legolas, Counter of Kills, you inspired this list, but you gotta have a number 2 slot. We do have one more that I think is a little bit worse. All right, and taking our top spot at number 1 for our top 10 worst gold signpost uncommons, we've got Unnatural Moonrise from Midnight Hunt. Let's break this card down. So, first of all, you need a creature for this card to do anything. That's not a huge hoop to jump through by any means, but it does mean that it's going to be worse than just like a good creature, right? Good on-rate creature. And then, when you do actually have a creature, you need to target that creature to get this effect, right? Obviously, it seems a bit obvious, but if you just want to become Knight, say you have a bunch of werewolves and you're like, great, I want to become Knight, you have to put one of your creatures at risk. You have to target it, and if your opponent removes the creature in response, this just fizzles, goes to the graveyard, and it doesn't become Knight. You spend your 2 mana, they kill your creature. When you do resolve this card, all right, it becomes Knight, maybe your creatures get a little bit bigger, but the effect you gain, +1/+1 trample, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, it's like pretty minor. I mean, if you're already winning, if the board's clear, okay, it's going to be pretty good. But, you know, that's true for most cards. And it has flashback, I think, to kind of make up for kind of an underwhelming effect. But in practice, this card just didn't really do that much. But the real ironic thing for a set that was about werewolves is the werewolves sucked. Like, this was the worst archetype in the set. When I think of like a good werewolf deck, you know, we've had pretty good werewolf decks in past sets. You're not playing something like a Bird Admirer, right? A 3 mana 1/4 reach. Even something like Village Watch, which is a little more aggressive leaning. It's understated, right? It's a 5 mana 4/3. So even if you did the thing, even if you had a deck with all these werewolves and you got to cast your Unnatural Moonrise, you flipped them, maybe you haven't had a big board and they didn't have that big of a board, it just still didn't do that much. So you're jumping through all these hoops, and let me really reiterate, it's a lot of hoops to jump through, and you're incurring a lot of risk to not get that much. So really just a true slop of a design, I think. And not, you know, to the designer's credit, it's hard to get everything right. And I want to say as a final note for this list, these are the worst of the worst. In the, you know, hundreds of signpost uncommons they've made at this point, most of them do actually pan out pretty well. I just thought it was kind of funny to highlight these ones that did flop. So if you enjoyed this list, please let me know. Please let me know also if you think that there's cards I missed that you would count as in your top 10. In any case, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.